All right, so feel free to interrupt me at any time with any questions you have. This is kind of a very, 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 very broad topic. So I kind of picked a couple of things to focus in on a little bit. But if you have any other questions outside of what I already have in here, feel free to just let me know. So the stuff that I thought we could talk about a little bit is a little bit about how medications are developed, because it's not necessarily the most intuitive process. And also some of the more newly approved medications for epilepsy, some that are on their way to being approved hopefully in the next year or so, and then some of the devices we use to treat epilepsy, some of the surgery techniques that are really brand new that we've been using more, and then just overall comments about clinical trials. So this is kind of a nice demonstration of the development of seizure medications. You can see that here we got time going across the bottom there and the number of seizure drugs going across the top. So between 1860 or so and 1910 or so, we only had 2 new drugs over 50 years. And you can see how the steepness of that curve at the end there tells you that the rate at which we're developing seizure drugs has accelerated exponentially over the last few decades. So when you're developing a drug that you think can be helpful for people with epilepsy, one of the first things you do is you can kind of screen different medications. You can look at all sorts of different chemical compounds, and you can test them. If they seem to be promising in terms of the way that they're structured, what they look like, you can then test them to see if they're effective with seizures with animals. And if they are, then a subset of those will go on to human trials. So kind of the hand-wavy number here is that if you have 10,000 compounds you start with, maybe 250 of them are appropriate to maybe test in an animal seizure model, and then about 10 of those will actually go on to be tested in humans, and not all the ones that get tested in humans will eventually be approved for humans, okay? There's different phases of clinical trials. Phase 1 is typically where we check how it works in normal people who don't have epilepsy. So what they want to do is they want to measure they're going to measure the levels of the medicine in the blood. They're going to look at how the people tolerate the medicine, whether there are side effects that are caused by the medicine, and they just want to make sure they know that it's a medicine that we can dose reliably, and just kind of all that basic groundwork. And then if it seems like it's tolerated okay, there aren't any big bad side effects, then what they do is they move on to a phase 2 or phase 3 trial, and that's where they actually test it in people with epilepsy to try to make their seizures better. Those trials can vary substantially depending on how many patients they enroll. Typically they're in the order of a few hundred patients, and they're very rigorous in terms of measuring things, measuring a lot of different measurements with blood tests and with other, and trying to keep track of how many seizures you're having, trying to keep track of the side effects you're having, and they watch you for a certain period of time. We'll talk a little bit more about kind of the specifics of that in a second. So this is kind of like an outline. Oh, the blue on white's a little tricky, huh? So this is an outline of how a drug trial usually goes when you're talking about a phase 2 trial. So the beginning here, this is before basically you get started on the drug they want to test. And then this is the phase during which you're started on the drug levels are increased. And usually they'll do, this white line here is people that are given a placebo pill or a pill that has no medication in it. Here's a line of people who get a lower dose of the medicine. Here's the line of people who get a higher dose of the medicine. And then this is the treatment phase where they get treated for a certain amount of time, either with a placebo, a low dose, or a high dose. And then there's a taper down phase like this here. And they can measure at any point during this process, usually during this part of the process and sometimes even later, how it affects your seizures, how it affects your drowsiness, does it make you nauseated, all these things. So this is kind of the simplest example of kind of like a phase 2 trial. What we know, though, is that when drugs are well tolerated, we know how to dose them and they're effective in seizures. Then they get to the point where the FDA might approve them for use in the United States. And so what do we know if a drug's FDA approved? Typically, it's been tested against 1, maybe 2 types of epilepsy and has been shown to be more effective than placebo. We also know that it's usually tested in patients who are treatment resistant, right? And that's really important, because if you look back here, before the people in this clinical trial are started on any of the study medicines, they're already on a couple drugs, 1 or 2 drugs. And the reason for that is, if you have somebody that just started having seizures, it's a little unethical to say, well, you might get a seizure med or you might get a sugar pill. Good luck, So you want to at least have 1 or 2 other drugs on board to make sure that you're not placing patients at risk for having seizures if they end up being in this placebo or even the low dose arm, right? So we know that it works better than placebo if it's FDA approved. We know that the patients it was tested on are more treatment resistant than a new onset patient, for instance. And we know that usually it's specifically tested in focal seizures in adults a lot of the times, and then in specific syndromes in kids sometimes. We know that over the short term, because we're talking maybe like 8 weeks right here, that it's tolerated pretty well. We don't know the long-term side effects necessarily, because it hasn't been out for a long time yet. And we know kind of the safety profile in anywhere between 1,500 and 15,000 patients, depending on how many they've tested in the phase 1, 2, and 3 trials, okay? What we don't know when a medicine is just FDA approved is we don't know how well it controls seizures in all the other types of epilepsy, because it wasn't really tested in those. We don't know about people who have never been on any meds, they have their first seizures, they're diagnosed with epilepsy, whether as monotherapy, like single medication, it's going to work or not. And then also, we don't know really how it compares to old or new seizure drugs that are already on the market, unless it was specifically compared against them in one of those trials, which it is very rarely done, right? So we also don't know, usually when they're first approved, unless there's specific instances where they're tested in children, but a lot of the drugs get approved in adults first. So when they get approved in adults, we don't necessarily know if they're effective or if they're well tolerated in kids. We don't know what the long-term safety issues are. And like I mentioned, we don't know if you use the drug by itself, how well does it work, because it's always used in combination nowadays. Okay? And then, so one of the drugs that you guys have probably heard about is Epidural X. This is one of the cannabinoid drugs. And basically, it focuses on the part of the cannabis plant that's thought to be more likely to be involved in regulating seizures and less likely to be involved in regulating things like hallucinations or psychoactive effects. Okay? This drug's been out for a while, and this one's a little bit of an exception to what I just talked about. So Epidural X was approved specifically for kids, right? Because it was tested in kids and in kids with different types of epilepsy. And the 2 that it showed the most significant improvement with was Lennox-Gastaut syndrome and Travail syndrome, okay? So because it was tested in those syndromes, then it was approved by the FDA for use in those syndromes. People will ask, I get probably in a given week of clinic every day, I get at least one question, well, could my kid be on Epidural X instead of Keppra or some other seizure medicine they're on? And the answer is I don't really know if it's going to work, because it's never really been tested in kids that have like benign Rolandic epilepsy and kids that have juvenile myoclonic epilepsy. We really just don't know, right? And so that's what I tell people. I say, I have no idea if it's going to work, and it's never been tested by itself as monotherapy, so typically we don't do that because we don't have enough information yet. And Epidural X just was FDA approved within the last couple of years. So as we're using it more and more, then we start to get a little more experience, and people start writing up papers and other research studies showing if it's effective and well tolerated or not in different types of epilepsy. Okay? So it was approved in, there was a study looking at Lennox-Gastaut syndrome patients, and it was placebo-controlled, meaning it was compared against that placebo pill or that fake pill. And they had found that there was the median drop seizure reduction in those patients was 44% in the Epidural X group versus 22% in the placebo group. So that looks like a pretty significant improvement comparatively. The other question we get a lot is, well, you've got Epidural X, which is an FDA-approved kind of a pharmaceutical grade CBD. What about other CBDs, artisanal CBDs? We typically point out a lot of the things that we worry about artisanal CBDs. I guess let me preface this by saying, like, it's the tricky thing as a neurologist with artisanal CBDs is you kind of don't know what you don't know about them, right? So you could have a really great group that does their own quality control metrics and make sure every batch is exactly the same and does a processing that's at the grade of an FDA-approved medicine. but there's nobody that regulates that if you're not an FDA-approved medication manufacturer. Does that make sense? So some of the things we worry about, and some of the things that have shown to be true, because artisanal CBDs have been around for a lot longer than Epidral X, is that we've had people who have tested the different batches of the CBDs that have come out, and from one bottle to the next, the concentration, the number of milligrams of CBD per milliliter of solution can vary substantially. So you can imagine your kid's on the medicine, you're doing well, you get a new bottle, your first bottle runs out, you switch to the new one, and all of a sudden they start having seizures again, and you have no really way to test what the CBD level is in their body, and that ends up being a big problem, you know, so we worry about that. A lot of the, and I'm going to give you a link on the next page to an FDA website that goes through and lists certain manufacturers that have had problems and had to have warnings and letters written. Another problem is whether or not the things that are in it, and the things that aren't in it aren't in it. So there have been a number of times where the FDA has cited different companies for selling CBD oil that has no CBD in it. There's other times where they cite people because it's CBD oil, but there's other things and even other anti-epileptic drugs that are in there with the CBD oil that aren't on the label. So you have to be very careful. Quality control, again, you know, some groups are really good at controlling quality, other ones aren't. How do you know which are which? There's no regulatory authority that looks into that, so I don't know. And then other things that get contaminated because it's a plant, right? So you're growing plants and you use things on plants like pesticides, additives, other things. You know, I actually just was meeting with a neurologist from Ohio, and they had somebody locally in Ohio that got in trouble by the FDA because they found high levels of lead in their CBD oil. And they were growing it close to a highway, which you can have lead in the soil from cars and other things on the highway. So, you know, these are the things that we worry about. And then also, you know, the fact that you would hope everybody is above bar in terms of, you know, trying to help kids and people who have refractory epilepsy, but unfortunately it's also a vulnerable population of people really looking for some miracle cure, miracle drug that can help their kid do better. And actually I added that last thing about cyberbullying. I've had parents who have tried artisanal CBD and had a really negative effect to it and have gone online to the online forums and said, hey, I tried this brand and my kid got really sick. And they've actually been bullied by other people on the internet about how dare you say that about CBD, you're taking away parents' hopes and other things, to the extent that they stop posting about it because they get threatened. So these things are all really kind of concerning things that we see. And this is, I put this in here, this is from the FDA, and this is kind of, I think, talks about kind of the way they look at it, which is similar to how we look at it. And it just says that over the past several years, there have been several warning letters to firms that market unapproved new drugs that allegedly contain CBD. Part of these actions, CBDs tested the chemical content in some of these products. Some of these were found to not contain the levels of CBD they claim to contain. They're not approved by the FDA for the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of any disease, and consumers should be aware before purchasing any such products. And that's the link there about. And if you just Google FDA CBD warning letters, you can find that. It basically lists all the different companies that they've tested and found problems with. So the bottom line of all this is, if you ever decide to try artisanal CBD, really try to do your homework well, and even consider going to some of these labs where you can pay to have them tested for you, to make sure it's as close to what they're saying it is as it can, just to be really careful, okay? In terms of up-and-coming meds, one of the ones we're most excited about is a med called fenfluramine. I looked at the list of talks, and if you've been to like half of the talks here, you've probably heard about this drug already because everyone's pretty excited about it. At CHOC, we're part of the study looking at Travail Syndrome with it. If you remember from way back in the day, there was a medicine called Fen-Phen, which was a weight loss medicine that got taken off the market. They thought that it caused problems with the heart, and so they pulled it from the market. Fenfluramine is part of that medicine. So they used just that fenfluramine part of the medicine and found that it is pretty effective in kids with Travail Syndrome, which is a syndrome where you have a mutated sodium channel in your neurons. And so it's a genetic epilepsy. So, and Travail Syndrome's kids can be very hard to treat, despite using multiple medications. But this fenfluramine is found in some kind of preclinical work, like with just a dozen or so patients, to dramatically improve seizure control in a lot of kids with Dravet. So, the main phase 2 trials are done. They're just kind of getting all their data analysis done and hopefully going to get FDA approval sometime soon. I don't know the timeline on that, unfortunately, we're pretty excited about using it. It seems to be pretty well tolerated too, at least in our experience, for Travail syndrome. So, like I said, we have a few kids in the study at CHOC that are in the extension now where they're allowed to just stay on the medicine until it gets approved. So a little bit about epilepsy devices. So there's 3 that we typically have in use for epilepsy, and in kids we typically use a VNS more than anything. The vagus nerve stimulator, the responsive neurostimulator, and then the deep brain stimulator. So the vagus nerve stimulator you've all probably heard about before. It's basically a little flat disc that they implant right kind of right below the collarbone in the chest under the skin. And then there's a wire. I don't know if you can see the picture, but there's a wire that kind of tracks up into the neck and then wraps around this big nerve in your neck called the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is involved with speech, and so the part of the nerve that it's wrapped around is typically not the part of the nerve involved with speech, but occasionally it can innervate things that do affect it. So a lot of times when we turn it on for the first time, it might make the kid want to cough because they can kind of feel that it feels a little funny in their throat, but then they usually adjust to it and that goes away. The vagus nerve stimulator is a nice option because it's an outpatient procedure. You come in for a couple hours, they implant it, you go home the same day, and then the newer ones actually, when you turn them on, you can auto-program them to automatically kind of ramp up their settings over the next couple of months. We used to have to see the patient every 1 to 2 weeks for like 2 months, which is really, a lot of fun to see your doctor once a week. And then, once it gets up to kind of therapeutic settings, and we start to usually see improvement in the seizure control. The benefits, you typically will see fewer seizures. You shouldn't expect a vagus nerve stimulator to completely wipe out your seizures and let you come off medication, but it typically drops the number of seizures you have and can also decrease the intensity of those seizures, which I think is really important, especially in some of the kids I take care of with like Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, where they have these drop attacks and they're hitting their head and hurting themselves. It can decrease the severity of those and keep them from injuring themselves as much. And then in terms of the surgery, it's a pretty quick recovery, and in terms of recovering from the seizures, typically they come back to baseline a little faster. And then it's a device that basically you need to change the battery every 4 to 5 years, but otherwise you're not taking a pill twice a day. It's just kind of always in you, always on. If it doesn't work, you just turn it off and leave it in you. And it's basically, once it's in there, it's very low maintenance to kind of keep it going over time. Okay. Like I mentioned, it can kind of innervate the vocal cords a little bit, and you can hear hoarseness or changes in the voice when the stimulator fires. If that's something that doesn't go away, we can always turn it off, and then it doesn't do that anymore. They feel sometimes kids will cough or get a tickle in their throat when we crank up the settings a little bit, and we can adjust them more subtly to avoid that happening. And then, and usually these sorts of side effects that people will get, they'll feel it at the beginning or when you increase it, but over time they just kind of get used to that feeling, and the sensation goes away. Okay. One of the more recent VNSs that they put out is one that actually can measure your heart rate too, which is really cool because about 80% of seizures that we know of have an increase in heart rate associated with them. So what the device does is it's kind of tracking your heart rate, and then if it sees your heart rate go up, it delivers a stronger stimulation. And that stimulation theoretically can help stop the seizure or keep it very short so that it doesn't spread to a bigger seizure. I've been pretty impressed with that function of this, and basically, I've been able to look at some of the data that comes out of these devices when we implant them about how often they're firing and how well they work. And I think that the heart rate stuff has really improved, at least in my experience, like the seizure control from these VNS devices. And then the second device we talk about is a responsive neurostimulator. Oh yeah.
For young kids, what's the age that can be done? Pretty early, or?
It can be done pretty early, it's kind of center dependent. The youngest ones that I've had put in my patients have been under a year of age. Not too far under a year of age, but probably the earliest would be 8 or 10 months. But typically a year or older is more common.
So my daughter has seizures where either when she's like falling asleep sometimes, or when she's waking up. Most of the time it's like in those times. But if she does happen to be awake, she kind of knows it's coming. Is is that one the one where you can like, make it start on its own or stuff?
Yeah, that's one thing I didn't mention, thanks for bringing that up, is that with the VNS, you get a magnet that's on a little wristband, and if you move that magnet across the chest in front of the stimulator, it will trigger it to give a stronger impulse to the nerve. So if you see somebody going into a seizure, you can swipe it once a minute, and it'll give stronger impulses, and that can theoretically shorten the seizure as well. Yeah. So responsive neurostimulation, which the one we have in the US is called NeuroPace, is basically a device, and you can see it's kind of implanted actually in a little, they make a little cavity in your skull, and they put it kind of here on the outside of your skull, a little more invasive than the VNS that's just in your chest. And basically the way that responsive neurostimulation works is that there's, so this is a different kind, but it's more up here. And basically there are electrodes that they put from that stimulator that go actually into your brain or on top of your brain inside your skull. And what that does is two things. One, it allows the stimulator to record information that says, you know, and look at the signals coming from your brain, so that when you do have a seizure, the neurologist and the engineer can look at the patterns from inside your brain during that seizure and help the machine learn how to identify your seizures better. And then if the stimulator senses that a seizure is about to happen, it applies an electrical current to that area of the brain, which then, in theory, will calm the seizure down, make it stop, maybe even before you really have any physical manifestations of the seizure. The electrodes that they use for these, there's two types. One is depth electrodes, which are kind of like a little needle with multiple electrodes on them that they put into the brain. And then there's subdural electrodes, which sit on top of the brain. And so when you're stimulating, you're directly stimulating the brain, which it doesn't need nearly as much current and other things as if you were trying to simulate the scalp or something like that. This is a type of device that we often, you know what, I switched to the other one, that's why it looks different. This is a type of device we often use if we have somebody that has a seizure that begins right near a very important part of their brain, right? So if your seizure begins right under the part that controls your dominant hand, and you failed a bunch of medicines, then we wouldn't want to go in and do surgery and remove where that seizure starts, because then you'd have a significant weakness in that hand. We could just we could possibly put an RNS on it or into it, and then when the seizure starts, it stops it, but you still have complete functional control of your hand the other 99.99% of the time. That's true of also speech areas, vision areas, any area that maybe just is a really hard to get to area. Or sometimes what some of our colleagues over at UC Irvine have done is when you have some people, especially adults, they have temporal lobe epilepsy, and sometimes both temporal lobes are injured, like in car accidents and such, and you really shouldn't remove both temporal lobes with surgery because that causes a whole host of other problems. So what they'll do is they'll figure out which temporal lobe is causing most of the seizures, and they'll remove the really more diseased temporal lobe, and then they'll put the RNS in the other temporal lobe, so that, you know, basically both temporal lobes, one is no longer there and the other one is controlled with an RNS, because they know more seizures will still come from that other one. So it's used like that sometimes. Some people also use it if they do a brain surgery, remove part of the brain they think the seizures are coming from, then they will stick the RNS where they remove that tissue, because in case they didn't get the whole seizure focus, now the RNS will stop those seizures for you, and hopefully you don't have to go in and do another surgery. So a lot of interesting applications for it. The thing that I think is probably the coolest about this is some of the other versions, like Neurovista, that have been approved in Europe and Australia for a really long time. They've been able to collect hundreds of days and even years of data from the inside of people's brains with epilepsy while they're walking around doing their thing, et cetera. And they've been able to learn so much about what the brain actually does. Because, I mean, otherwise, I mean, could you imagine wearing an EEG around for like 300 days in a row? Like, that would be extremely uncomfortable and have its other issues. But basically they're able to look at all this data, and they look at these huge time frames, and they've learned all this really cool stuff. Like, they've learned that people will have large time frames of patterns to their epilepsy. So their seizures might cluster every like 48 days, right? And it doesn't even necessarily match menstrual cycles or other things. It's just there are these large scale patterns that they see. They're also seeing that people with epilepsy, a lot of times their seizures will happen in a 2-hour window every time they happen. And then the other thing they found is that that individuals with epilepsy, and then to a lesser extent families of people with epilepsy, are like probably miss a lot of the seizures that are happening because they have this now golden truth of exactly if the seizures are happening or not, and then they have patients record if the seizures are happening, and then they compare those two, and it kind of makes sense that if you have seizures, and the seizures, some of those seizures can cloud your consciousness, can give you amnesia and other things. So trying to be able to report your own seizures over time is really tricky. And this device has shown us that, and so I think this is, if you want to look forward 20 years in the future, I think we're going to have versions of this that are less invasive, that are going to be, used more readily in people with epilepsy, and we're going to be using them sooner and not nearly as a last resort. I think right now, it's really cool technology, and we're learning so much from it, and I think it's going to accelerate a lot in the future into a lot of new devices. And then, so this picture is actually the deep brain stimulator, and that's why the stimulator is in his chest and not on his head, so that makes sense. And this is a stimulator where the electrodes are actually implanted into the brain, into the anterior nucleus of the thalamus, and basically kind of like a VNS, but instead of stimulating a nerve out here, it's stimulating a deeper part of your brain. This has shown a lot of promise too, and is starting to be used in adults now. There have been a few kids that have been implanted with this, so we don't really know too much about how effective it can be, but we're going to start doing more of them really soon. And this is pretty interesting that they looked at 110 adults that were implanted, and they saw a pretty dramatic improvement in their seizures. And these are also people who have failed multiple medications. So for when they test it, it's almost always focal seizures. And these ones were with or without secondary generalization, which is going into like a grand mal. So almost every device is tested in that population because that's the most common type of epilepsy in adults is focal seizures, and probably temporal lobe is chief among those. And so just by getting enough numbers to test your medicine, your drug, or your device or whatever, that's what ends up being tested on. The exceptions are one like Epidural X, which were tested on people with LGS looking at atonic seizures, which is not focal at all, So, but yeah, this was approved based on focal seizures with or without secondary generalization. But I think, when we have, especially in pediatrics, we're excited because, we have a lot of different epilepsies that really you can't fit into a category as well, like infantile spasms, even absence epilepsy. Sure, it's a generalized epilepsy, but it's not, it's very different than a generalized tonic-clonic. And I've plenty of kids that will have a 20-second long absence and just keep talking right through it and eating their food and coloring and not even color outside the lines. And other ones that have an absence and just stop what they're doing, stare, blink, and they completely are amnestic of what happened. So I think it'd be interesting to see if these, because absence is supposedly mediated by these deeper structures in the thalamus, and so it makes a lot of sense to me that it's an epilepsy where the thalamus is causing problems. Maybe if we regulate it with a stimulator, we can get it to kind of get back in shape and do its thing, but that's very theoretical. Absolutely, yeah. There's actually a few patients that have all three, DBS, RNS, and VNS. I've been told, I haven't met them. But typically, the VNS is the least invasive, right? It's a 2-hour outpatient thing. If you fail VNS, then depending on whether you would do an RNS or a DBS, just depends kind of on the type of epilepsy you have, if you have a lesion or not, and kind of where the seizures are coming from. And then, some people you could imagine go on and get an RNS, and maybe it works for a while, then it stops working, and all that's left really at that point is probably a DBS. And so, there's some people that go through all three, and there's no reason you can't have more than one, is what I've been told.
What are the numbers on the VNS?
Like how many people have had them?
Yeah, because we know most people are on medications, but it's kind of scary, whether it's the least invasive of VNS or not, and I'm just curious what kind of numbers of people are on it that you're aware of.
I could probably Google it and give you an exact number, but I think it's over 100,000 now.
Really?
It's a huge number, yeah, because VNS has been around for a while. Yeah. So you do the math on that, and I think it's definitely way over 10,000. But I think I remember reading. I can Google it in a second and tell you. But yeah. But I think remember reading that there were around 100,000 now. But okay. Cool. And then some of the new cool stuff that I think is also going to be the future of kind of how we treat epilepsy surgery is using laser techniques. So there's different devices that have been out. There's a Visual Ace, there's a Neuroblate that are different laser systems that different hospitals use. And basically the idea with the laser is that it's a very small device that can be put into the brain through a tiny hole in the skull. And then what it does is it just heats up the brain tissue to a temperature at which the brain tissue then dies, right? So basically, if you have an area of the brain that you think the seizures are coming from, instead of, opening up the skull, going in, dissecting the dura, moving everything around, resecting it, tying off all the blood vessels, that you can basically just use a laser to heat the area and kill all of the brain tissue that is generating the seizure, avoiding all the brain tissue that's important for other things in life, and then pull it back out through a little 4-millimeter hole and then put a suture in it and you're done. So this is something that's been out for a few years, and I think in the adult world, everything in the adult world has been used a lot more than kids. But in the adult world, they're using this a lot for things like temporal lobe epilepsy, where you have the temporal lobe and you need to get on the inside of the temporal lobe, and then they'll go, because basically whatever, you can kind of see here, there's this little line. So they put the probe in, and then they basically, as they're heating it, they pull it out, right? So you can kind of, you do the ablation along a pathway. So you imagine with the temporal lobe, it's kind of this long tubular structure, so they can put the probe basically right down the temporal lobe and then just ablate right along the inside of it on the way out. They also use it for conditions where you have multiple areas. So some people who have like polyventricular nodular heterotopia, so along your ventricles you have little pockets of abnormal brain tissue. They can go in and laser each of those individually. If you have like tuberous sclerosis, where you have multiple kind of benign tubers that are sitting at the bottom of your cortex, and you can go in and laser specific ones. And the other cool thing about it is, unlike when you do a craniotomy and there's a longer recovery and there's scarring and other things, you can do a laser treatment, and then if it doesn't work 6 months later, you can do another laser treatment, and basically you're just making a tiny hole each time that heals up within a couple weeks. So we're really excited about this because I think it's more of like the ninja approach, the like sniper approach to getting epilepsies, and it's so minimally invasive that we're excited about using it and trying to just, because if you haven't, a lot of times when you have an area of the brain you think is causing the seizures that you want to do surgery on, a lot of the risk of the surgery is by doing the big craniotomy, by being under anesthesia for 6-8 hours, all that stuff. Some of these, the one we have is robotic guided. Like a computer guides it, and you tell the computer what you want to do, and it will move things for you precisely. So it's really kind of like a futuristic thing, and we're excited to see how it works in kids. We're going to probably do our first 2 patients later this month at CHOC with one of the lasers. It's a pretty neat technology, and so you can kind of combine this technology too with other things we do. Like, I don't know if you guys have heard of stereo EEG, where we implant electrodes into the brain to try to figure out where the seizures come from. Well, a lot of times we'll do that, and then what you can do is when you go back to the operating room to take those needle electrodes out from the stereo EEG, you can basically take the needle electrode out, put the laser in, and then laser exactly where you saw that seizure coming from on your stereo EEG. So this is some sort of techniques that are just being kind of started now and haven't really been fully, formed and tested yet, but they're really exciting for us because it's this very precision way of doing it as opposed to the way we've done in the past. So, do you have a question?
So this laser surgery sounds like an outpatient?
So we usually watch overnight in the hospital afterwards. I would bet you, and also depends. So you can just laser a teeny tiny little area. You can also laser a really big area. So depending on how much is the laser, where it is, how stable the patient is afterwards, I think once we get more track data on this, we'll probably be able to stratify which people can come and get it and go right home, which people can be in. Usually you go home within 2 days of this, unless you have swelling or nausea or vomiting or other things that can happen. But it's definitely, when you're talking about doing a craniotomy and doing resective surgery, you're talking more like weeks in terms of being ready to go home and whatnot.
It sounds like minimal anesthesia as well.
It's much shorter. And on average, I think it's 90 minutes. Whereas like obviously bigger surgeries take longer. Yeah.
Aside from the risk of the craniotomy where it's moving the brain, is this laser surgery, does it also make it where you're more accurate with what you're getting rid of?
I don't know if we know the answer to that yet. I think, so if you're asking a question, is it more accurate to have the laser do it versus having a surgeon who can see the actual area they're resecting and removing it? The surgeon's got to be more accurate. Because with this, you're basing this on an MRI, right? And the one, like the laser that we have, for instance, once the device is in the patient, they actually do an MRI with the device in the patient to make sure they know exactly where it is. And so they're doing a lot of things to make this super duper precise. The tricky part is that, so when you're looking at what part of the brain is generating like a focal seizure, sometimes when you're measuring with stereo EEG and other things, you can see, oh yeah, this is where the seizure starts, this is how it spreads, but you're never measuring the whole brain, right? So even if you see an area of the brain that starts firing 3 seconds before the patient feels anything seizure-y related, you don't know if there's something close to there that starts 4 seconds before the seizure, right? So you have to combine all these different techniques to come up with where we think the whole zone is that's generating the seizure, because if you go in with a laser and you just say, I'm going to take out this tiny little piece because I think that's where it is, and you get most of it but not all of it, the seizures are probably going to come back. So if you're looking at how well your seizures are controlled, still our greatest probability of seizure freedom comes with resections, because they're usually bigger and they're usually removing more tissue, and so they're more likely to get the entirety of the seizure focus, if that makes sense. And it's not, don't take that as meaning when we do resections we just cut out tons of tissue, and I'm not a surgeon, so but it's more that you tend to be able to do more with a resection than you could with laser because it's so small. But if you have a tiny little lesion, maybe this is all you need, So the other way of thinking of this is saying, you know what, we think we know it's here, let's go in, let's do the laser, and if the seizures go away, fantastic, and if they don't, we're in the same spot we were before and we're going to do a resection anyways, So there's different...
What about being closer to areas that are critical that you don't want to mess with, that can give you better chance of not targeting those areas or hitting those areas, I guess?
It just depends on which areas we're talking about, because if you're talking about an area that's here on the motor strip right here, a surgeon's going to be able to see that. They can put an electrode on that, measure exactly where the motor function is, and then avoid that area. With a laser, we can't really do that, right? We just say, okay, we look at the MRI, this is where we think the motor function is, so let's not laser that. But unless we have an electrode in there to map it, and we map out where exactly it is, you're not going to be as confident that you're going to miss that area with something like a laser. Now, like with one of our laser patients, we were able to map the motor strip with our stereo EEG, and so we know where the motor strip is, and we've never done a craniotomy on him, and we just got our surgeon put that electrode in exactly the right spot, and so we know where that patient's motor strip is on the MRI. That's why we're going to go and laser right next to it, because we think that's where the seizures are coming from. And then if it doesn't work, we're kind of in the same spot we were anyways. Cool.
I guess I was kind of wondering, I guess the team kind of come up with an approach of which one's better.
Oh yeah. It's a group of 15 people that all have to agree, which is hard enough, But yeah, it's all the epileptologists, it's the neurosurgeon, it's the neuropsychologist, it's the the neuroradiologist. Everybody sits down in a room and agrees on what the next best thing to do is.
But this one's still good because like you said, if you do it and it doesn't get it all, you can come back and do it.
Exactly.
The riskier dissection later, because it is a little more riskier because of the craniotomy.
Yeah, exactly. The craniotomy is a bigger surgery. It takes longer. There's longer recovery. So this is a much less invasive approach, meaning it's lower risk. It's also less likely to completely control your seizures. But it's one of those things that if it works, great. If it doesn't work, well, you're kind of probably where you were to begin with. And now that's not where the seizure is because you lasered it, right? So yeah, it's a new technology and it's very exciting, and I think we're going to learn a lot about how to use it, and I think we're going to be seeing a lot more kind of laser technique coming out in the next 5 years or so, which will be pretty exciting. And then let's see. Oh, and they also don't have to shave your whole head when you do it, which is cool. And then you can return to light activities within a few days of that. So, okay. Oh, sorry, did you want to take a picture of that? Go for it. So the other thing, so clinical trial-wise, one of the things I wanted to highlight was in pediatrics, we have this group, Pediatric Epilepsy Research Consortium. So it's like a national network in the U.S. under the American Epilepsy Society of, 30-plus centers that all treat pediatric epilepsy. And they have all these different groups of disorders that they focus on. And so we meet twice a year. And we try to focus on doing these, because a lot of these diseases we take care of in kids are rare. And so, when you only have 2 to 5 kids in 10,000 that have infantile spasms, even if you're a really busy center, it's going to take you years to get enough patients to come through to enroll in your studies to actually make headway with your research. So it's ways to leverage, like using 20 centers all doing the same study together. It's a pretty cool group. So, and then, if you're a patient with seizures or you have a family member with seizures, one question is, well, why be involved with clinical trials? Some of them, like medications or devices, may actually benefit you, because a new medicine, maybe other medicines didn't work and this medicine might work. And also it will help the discovery of medicines to help other people with epilepsy as well. And then certain medications are only available through clinical trials if they're not approved. And then once they're approved, obviously, then you can get them, with a prescription. But if you're in the clinical trial oftentimes and the medication is really working and the trial ends, they'll do an extension where you're allowed to stay on the medicine until it gets FDA approved. Otherwise, you would have zero access to that medicine. There's this interesting thing that I think parents ask about sometimes is they say, well, if a medicine's already been through all the trials and it's not approved, then how come the company won't give it to me, for compassionate use or other things like that? And the thing is, if a company is on the verge of getting an FDA approval for a medication and they let people use it for compassionate use and somebody that uses it they still have to track those patients. They don't just give it to you and say good luck. So somebody, let's say one of those people completely not having anything to do with the medicine they're working on passes away or has a really bad medical problem, that has to be reported to the FDA, and that can completely derail their FDA approval of the medicine. And so if you think about it from a big picture standpoint, it has the potential to keep thousands of people from accessing that drug in a timely fashion, so that's why they don't do it. And it's heartbreaking sometimes because you're like, this really would work well for this kid, but you have to it's hard to understand, but you have to understand that that's why they do it, so that it doesn't get derailed. Okay? And then how to get involved. So if you or your family members have a certain type of epilepsy or a certain syndrome or other things, there's this really cool website that's called clinicaltrials.gov. And basically, I put the name on the next page. So there's the name up there. So basically, it's a search engine for clinical trials in the United States. Anything that's a clinical trial that's approved by the NIH needs to be on there, and most other trials are on there too. So you can, I'll show you the search page here. So you can put in the condition or disease, other terms like a drug name or an investigator name or a center and what country it's in. And then you can look and see what trials are open, recruiting, not. You guys probably can't read this right. Totally too small. So this says enrolling by invitation, approved for marketing, withdrawn, recruiting, that's the green one, treatment of something disorders in children with Travail Syndrome. And then they tell you where it's being done, who the contact is, and then you can reach out to those people as a patient too, which is super cool, right? And then it's also interesting if you know that a trial is not enrolling anymore, or you want to see what the status is, the status will be updated on here too. Like you can see approved for marketing means that like this is stiripentol for patients with Travail Syndrome, and stiripentol was just FDA approved a few months ago for patients with Travail Syndrome. So you can look up stuff like that here, and it's a really nice up-to-date place to look for it. Cool? So we go there too when we have patients that have unique or rare diseases. Okay, that's all I had about, broadly speaking, clinical trials, epilepsy research, and up-and-coming stuff. So 2:59, not bad, huh? Any questions you guys have?
I have a question.
Sure.
As far as the drugs that they're prescribing to you, obviously if you are able to categorize the epilepsy, that makes it a little easier for them to be a good drug. Otherwise, it seems like they're kind of, just picking drugs. Is there anything that lists I know you mentioned the sodium channel and things like that. Is there anything that lists all the drugs and what they do, why they're used and why they're chosen?
Kind of. So it's tricky because if you look at why they were approved by the FDA, it's going to mostly be for focal seizures in adults, right? If you really want to drill down and see where they've been effective, I would encourage you to look. There are some things that are put out by different societies, like the American Epilepsy Society puts out like a huge thing on anti-epileptic drugs and what they're good for, that talks about different conditions that they treat. Often your best bet is to look up the condition, and there's probably a resource that tells you what drugs work well in that condition. It's a little harder to say, like, what does Keppra work for? Geez, that list is extremely long and it's changing all the time, you know. So if there's a specific condition, it's a lot easier to look that up. And then your neurologist, your epileptologist should be able to answer those questions for you too. You know, there's many different mechanisms of drugs, and that's how they work, you know. There's over almost 30 drugs now that we use for epilepsy. And so each one has different things it works well for or not. Some of them are broad spectrum, meaning they treat like everything. So if you have a type of epilepsy that hasn't yet been categorized, we don't really know why you have seizures, sometimes we tend to use the broader ones so that we don't, because certain drugs can make certain types of epilepsy worse. We try to avoid those if we don't know exactly if you're focal or generalized, for instance. But then we use the EEG, the long-term monitoring, to try to figure all that out and to guide our medication choices. So yeah, I would say bottom line is to look it up specifically by the diagnosis you're trying to treat or the type of seizure you're trying to treat, and then there's a lot of stuff out there on that.
Well, it just seems like something, like, for example, my daughter, like, she's failed multiple drugs, like, she started with phenobarbital and then Keppra and now she's on Vimpat. So it's kind of like, you know, when they first failed, and they just raise the dosage, right, and keep doing it, and then eventually determine that's failed and move to another drug. Just kind of wanted to know, like, the differences in those, or maybe she should be given more of a combination of drugs, whether, you know, the sodium channel one maybe with something else that does something else, or how that kind of all works together.
Yeah, that's totally a meld of art and science of epilepsy. And all of us are a little different, right? So my preferences are a little different than even people I practice with. You know, some people practice very similar to me. I trained up at UCLA, so most of the UCLA folks are very similar to me, except I use more felbamate than they do. People who trained at other centers, it basically depends on how you trained and who trained you in terms of your preferences. So one thing I always tell my patients, if I'm running out of ideas and I'm on my 4th and 5th line ideas for them, and I'm like, you know what, this isn't working, I say, you know what, go see a different epileptologist. Because I know that I'm doing the best I can, but maybe the way I do it isn't the right way for your kid, and maybe someone else's way actually works better, and that's great, you know. So often I think it's a good idea if you feel like the seizures are not under control and the medicine, and you want to see what somebody else's thoughts are on other medicines to use, is maybe go talk with somebody else. And most epileptologists are very open to being like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Here's a list of 5 people you should go see, you know. So I think it's really hard once you start failing meds. It's really hard to anticipate, unless you have a very specific conditions, which meds will work and which ones won't. And so it ends up being a lot of trial and error, which is like super frustrating. But the way things are going with precision medicine and other things, I wouldn't be surprised if we'll be doing some gene tests in the next 5-10 years that can give us a better indication which medicines you'll tolerate better and get less side effects from, which medicines work better for your epilepsy. So.
Can you just go over fenfluramine one more time, and where you are on that, and when is it going to be, or when do you anticipate it being available to the general public?
Yeah, the bottom line is when it's available, I have no clue, because I don't think the FDA even knows the answer to that question. We always are told things about when it's going to be looked at, when it's going to be approved and all that. So the fenfluramine, that's the one that was a part of it. It used to be a weight loss drug back in the day, and then it was withdrawn in '97 because of these heart disease, valvular heart disease. Now, just it should be noted in the study that's going on, they actually have seen 0 incidences of heart disease in the kids that are getting this, which is super cool. And then they're studying it just in Travail Syndrome, and they're finding it to be so far pretty effective. So I would anticipate it will probably be reviewed and or approved, I would guess within the next 6 to 12 months. And then commercially available, I have no clue, because it just depends on the company their programs and how they distribute and manufacturing and all these things. Because if your drug's not approved, there's no reason you should be scaling your manufacturing process, right? Because then if it doesn't get approved, you spent all this money building a big plant and you're not using it now. So a lot of times that doesn't happen until the drug gets approved. And there's typically anywhere between, I'd say, a 6 to 9 month lag after approval until you really get good commercial availability for the drugs. Some are better than others.
Just to follow up, the kids that are on that trial at the moment are still on
Mhm.
that learning?
If it helped them, yeah.
If it helped them?
Mhm.
And so is the trial still going, or?
The trial looking at effectiveness is done, but they're in the open label extension, meaning they're just allowed to stay on the drug if it worked for them. Because it's kind of like not cool to be like, hey, this drug worked well, we're not going to let you get it now. So yeah, so that's, and the terms of that extension is for 3 years or until FDA approval, basically, whichever comes last. So, you know, or whichever comes first, yeah. So basically, they're going to be on the drug as long as that it's helping them, not giving them side effects, and they want to be on it until it either gets approved by the FDA or for 3 years, which it probably will be approved within 3 years, I would think, so. But it's a pretty exciting drug. I think once it gets approved for Dravet, we're probably going to see a lot of clinical trials looking at it in other epilepsies. Cool. Other questions you have? Anything else?
Do they have clinical trials for adults?
Oh yeah, many more clinical trials for adults than kids. I'm just a pediatric epilepsy person, so I tend to talk more about kids stuff. But there's tons of clinical trials for adults. You know, and if you look at that clinicaltrials.gov, it'll list whether it's for children or adults on that. So all the new medicines that are coming out of the pipeline, almost all of them get tested in adults first. So, yeah. Okay. Thanks for sticking it. Oh,
I know you and your wife work together, right?
yeah.
On different things. Weren't you applying for a grant or something recently, or?
Yeah. So my wife's a neuroscientist at UC Irvine. So we collaborate on epilepsy research together. So we had 2 grants that we had applied for, and we got one of them. Yay! So like the Lennox-Gastaut Syndrome Foundation, and I don't know if they announced it yet, but I was told I'm allowed to tell people. So they're going to fund us for 2 years to look at Lennox-Gastaut syndrome and look at the use of felbamate with that, and also we do a more of an engineering approach to epilepsy where we look at EEG signals and we write computer programs and algorithms to analyze them in ways that we as humans can't by looking at them. And so we found some really cool stuff that we think is relevant for determining if a kid with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome is going to do well or not on a particular medicine. So we're going to test that in about 100 kids that we've collected at CHOC. So yeah, that's starting like now, which is super cool. I'm going to hopefully find out this week that the IRB approved our protocol. And then the other one was a big NIH grant, and we just got our scores from that, and it got scored, which means it's in the top half, which is like super cool because it's our first NIH thing ever. And basically, based on our score, it probably won't be funded with this round, but we're allowed to resubmit it 1 or 2 times, and they think it'll probably eventually get funded. So that's super cool too. Thanks for asking. So yeah, very exciting.
Congrats.
Yeah, no problem.